Okay, thank you for everyone for joining. We are expecting more to join us, but we'll get going. Welcome for the first Food Thinkers from the Centre for Food Policy of 2023. The Centre for Food Policy Food Thinkers series is all about hearing from women in academia, business, civil society, and beyond across the food system who've got big ideas about redesigning food systems. And so we're delighted to welcome 2023 with Sofía Monsalve, the Secretary General of FEAN International, which is a human rights organization working for the right to food and nutrition. My name is Corinna Hawkes. I'm Director of the Centre for Food Policy, and I'm delighted to host you today. Sofía will be talking to us about who's setting the table, countering the corporate capture of food systems governance, and we're really looking forward to hearing from her. The webinar will be recorded and made available afterwards for viewing for those who weren't able to join. If you'd like to hear information about our Food Thinkers series, please do sign up. The link is in the chat box, and you can put your name in the chat box to be added to that list. We'll also put the link in for our Masters in Food Policy. Applications are open for our Masters in Food Policy, and we often get asked by participants for that link. So we've put it in the chat for you. So the way things are going to run today is after my brief introduction, Sofía is going to talk for around 40 minutes. As she talks, if a question comes to mind, please do put it directly into the Q&A box, not the chat, but the Q&A box. The chat box will be open, but please put it in the Q&A box. And then I will ask Sofía the questions that we asked. I'll aim, of course, to get through all of the questions. But if we get a lot of questions, I'll moderate them and focus on making sure we include a diversity of questions and questions which repeat certain themes. So if we really want you to listen, this is a Food Thinkers, we want you to listen, we want you to focus, we want you to reflect and ask some good questions. But if you do want to tweet about it, feel free, that would be great. Our hashtag is Food Thinkers, and our Twitter handle is Food Policy at City, Food Policy City. So with no further ado, let's move over to Sofía, who, as I said earlier, is the Secretary General of FEAN International, the international human rights organization working for the right to food and nutrition. And before becoming Secretary General, in 2016, she coordinated FEAN's program on land and natural resources for over 15 years, and she has extensive advocacy experience in the human rights system, in FAO and the UN Committee on World Food Security. And she recently joined the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, and as you can see from this presentation here. So over to Sofía to talk about countering the corporate capture of food systems governance. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Corinna, and good evening to all the audience. First of all, I would like to thank the for inviting me to this Food Thinkers series. I think it's very interesting to share and present the ideas that in the IPES Food panel we are about to launch a new briefing is part of the series on global governance of food systems. And what I will be presenting today is the result of a collaborative effort among several members of the panel. It's a paper authored by Molly Anderson, Jennifer Clapp, Shalmali Gutal, Anna Pascal, and myself. And it is about food governance issues. And actually, our intention is to put an issue on the agenda of our discussions, which we consider is neglected. And it is the issue about power, and in the issue of what we consider the corporate capture of governance of food systems. So please, next slide. Yeah, so my presentation, as I said, is about this paper. In FEAN, but also with IPES Food, I have done several studies on related issues on multi-stakeholderism, but also on corporate capture of certain UN agencies as like FIO. So what I want to present you today is basically that I think we all agree that we are in a massive crisis, not only a food price crisis, but also the ecological destruction, the climate catastrophe that we are facing, rising malnutrition, but also war and conflict. So we all agree it's a multiple crisis. We know that this is really very severe. The numbers, the figures are increasing, acute food insecurity. I mean, the reports from WFP and FIO are continue being extremely worried. So it is clear that we have a serious problem. We all agree also that a transformation of food system is needed, but we consider that the issue of the power imbalances in the governance of food systems is, as I said, neglected so far. It is really avoided, and we talk a lot about technological transformation of many things, but not of power relationships. And this is, I think, the focus of my talk here today. How can we rebalance these extreme power imbalances in food governance? And food governance is meant here to be basically decision-making around food issues, the institutions, the policies, the actors, the regulations, the norms that affect decision-making around food. Next slide, please. And our concern here is that the corporate influence over food systems has become the new norm. We think it's extraordinary, and therefore we call it corporate capture, because in our sense, corporations are exercising undue influence in public policies. But it has become the new normal, and it's not really the case that many actors, many governments are raising questions and are actually alerts and alarms in order to undo that process or to roll it back. And I think that last year we saw the United Nations convene a UN Food System Summit in 2021. I don't know how many of you followed that debate, because a large part of civil society, part of academia as well, were of the opinion that this summit was actually extremely biased, and the agenda of the summit was more or less controlled by corporate interest. So this is, let's say, like the tip of the iceberg in of course, in a long process, historical process where corporations have exercised a lot of influence over food systems, but also over the governance of food systems. And we have coined this term of what we are seeing now is a change in governance, moving towards a public center governance, towards what it is called a multi-stakeholder process, where corporations, academia, NGOs, and international organizations have all a stake, a place around the table to decide about issues of global governance. So this is what we will be looking today. And first of all, please, next slide. As I was saying, this is a process that is a historic process. You can trace it back. And therefore, in our paper, well, first of all, we differentiate between the visible ways how we see that corporations are exercising a growing influence over decisions around food and food systems. But there are also less visible ways and channels behind the scenes where they exercise this power. So I want to elaborate now on, first of all, on these visible channels. And I started talking about the multi-stakeholder initiatives, which became, and the UN Food System Summit last year was probably the largest experiment with multi-stakeholder governance that we have seen. But of course, it started before, and probably you can trace it back, that multi-stakeholderism, particularly in the area of agriculture and food, started around the 90s with all the initiatives, for instance, on certification schemes. So it's a sort of voluntary market-based governance. And you remember probably still initiatives like the Round Table on Sustainable Palm Oil, or the Round Table on Responsible Soy, Bon Sucro, or the Round Table on Non-Sustainable Beef. So all these were initiatives in order to establish sustainable certification schemes for global commodity supply chains, in order to introduce some basic standards related to labor rights sometimes, or to environmental rights, but all of them were voluntary. And of course, it's a way to, I wouldn't say to regulate these commodity supply chains, but introduce certain standards around that. And with the Transnational Institute, we did a study on these multi-stakeholder initiatives across different sectors. And it turned out that the sector of agriculture and food has been probably the biggest sector with all this type of multi-stakeholder initiatives. Another area where you can see the influence of corporate actors is the public-private partnerships. With all the processes around privatization of agricultural systems, you saw that, of course, the private sector has taken a much larger role in food systems, including policy dialogues, taking influence in policy making. And here, I think that initiatives like the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN, or the Scaling Up Nutrition Movement, and SUN, the Food and Land Use Coalition, for instance, or the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, are examples of these public-private partnerships, which are very, very active in the area of policymaking. So they advise governments, foster certain types of dialogues in order to introduce certain policies around nutrition or agriculture and other issues. The third visible way is, of course, funding of global food governance fora. And here, I think that with the crisis in public funding, not only at national level, but also at the international level, many of the UN institutions are now resorting to seek private foundations or donations for their budgets. One of the examples that we have in our paper is, for instance, the case of the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, the CGIAR system, which is founded by philanthropic foundations like the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation became actually the second largest donor of the CGIAR system in 2020. And its funding is nearly around $100 million. So this is not only the case of the CGIAR system. In FIO, we can also see that 31% of the budget of FIO comes from member states, from countries, while almost 70% is mobilized through voluntary contributions from members, but also from other partners, meaning philanthropic foundations, but also business associations. In the case of FIO, it is unfortunately very difficult to say how much money is coming from corporations, because FIO, unfortunately, is not sufficiently transparent in terms of providing public information on the way its budget is funded. So if you go, for instance, to the FIO's Finance Committee, where you find the annual audited accounts of FIO budgets, you don't have more specific information in terms of the detailed breakdown of private sector contributions. But last year, you probably also heard about, we also participated in a campaign, for instance, about the association of FIO with CropLife. So we know for sure that fertilizers associations, agrochemical corporations provide contributions to the FIO budget. When it comes to the less visible ways, or the behind the scenes ways of influencing global governance, We highlight in our paper, well, again, we refer to the history, and probably if we go back to the 17th century, to the British Empire or to the Dutch Empire, of course, we will see that global companies were controlling the markets, for instance, for commodities like sugar or tea. And during the 19th and 20th century, we saw the rise of private grain trading and agricultural input firms. What it is interesting, and as I said, Jennifer Clapp is part of the teams of authors of this paper, and she has been studying the influence of these large corporations. We say in the paper, based on the research, what it is interesting is that the large corporations today, like for instance, BASF, Bayer, John Deere, or the former Monsanto, Dow, and DuPont were already basically consolidated their power already in the early years of the 20th century. So again, we want to highlight that this is a historical development which became, let's say, much more pronounced in the 80s with all the policies about the regulation and when the antitrust protections and enforcement was weakened in the course of neoliberalism. So what we see is an even greater consolidation and concentration in large farms in the agri-food sector. And well, I don't want to bother you right now with examples of these mergers. You know them probably also very well. In any case, what we see today is that in most segments of the agri-food system, just few corporations play dominant roles in the markets. If you take agricultural inputs, or if you go to global food trade, food processing, or grocery retail. These significant market shares give them what it is typically called market power, and this enables them to shape the contours of markets for the products they sell. And this is, of course, problematic because they can create barriers that prevent other firms from competing with them. It is also clear that as these companies increase in size, they are able to attract more financial investment, including from investment banks and powerful asset management firms such as BlackRock. What we see also is that this market power of agribusiness corporations is deeply entwined with their ability to exercise also political power. So these corporations can spend large amounts of money to directly lobby government policymakers and regulators. And here it is the example of the US, where, for example, across all segments of the food chain, corporate lobbying has nearly doubled in the past few decades from, for instance, about $80 million in 2000 to over 150 million in 21. Another way of exercising a lot of influence is funding of science, and of course taking influence in through the sponsorship of academic research, that it is sympathetic to corporate interests, and that can also influence the direction of policy and governance. And you probably also remember here the cases of Monsanto, where they have influenced, for instance, regulatory making decisions around the use of glyphosate. The last form that we present in the paper is about how corporations have been able to participate and negotiate international and regional trade agreements. And of course, these trade agreements and these policies on investment and trade agreements have been shaped in a way which is friendly to the interests of these corporations. Okay, so the next slide, please. So I've been trying to make the case, or how does this corporate capture of food governance looks like. Now, I want to have some say some words about why is this problematic? Why is it not fine that corporations are doing their business? What is the problem with that? And I think that, as I said, we see three main problems regarding governance issues. One, at the level of governance processes. Second, at the level of governance outcomes. And third, in terms of accountability. In terms of governance process, we think that it is deeply problematic that the multi-stakeholder initiatives actually blur the lines between the different roles of different actors. So we think that one, for instance, is the role of governments as duty bearers of, for instance, human rights and environmental obligations. And another different role is, of course, of the rights holders. So multi-stakeholder initiatives tend to equalize and blur the lines of the different roles of responsibilities of the different actors. So these processes are also often, because they are informal, they are opaque and not necessarily transparent in terms of what are the rules and who set the rules. So there is no democratic scrutiny, so to say, and deliberation in terms of setting the rules of such spaces. We also observed that in terms of processes, these multi-stakeholder initiatives tend to constrain the agenda and narrow the scope of solutions towards approaches that don't question corporate interest. So in that sense, these spaces actually don't allow for addressing differences, addressing conflicts of power, for instance, of discrimination, and therefore they ended up excluding marginalized groups and voices. So this is in terms of, as I said, the problems that we see in terms of governance. In terms of governance outcomes, I think that in our different initiatives of collaborative research, there is almost none empirical study showing actually the what are actually the outcomes of this multi-stakeholder initiative. So the empiric evidence is very, very scarce on how effective these initiatives are to reach the objectives that they are supposedly wanting to reach. This is one of the problems. The second problem relates to and I think we see that in the context of our food crisis, rising crisis, malnutrition, all the transformation is showing that that these past initiatives, because some of them started already in the 90s, have not been able actually to solve the problems that, for instance, global commodity supply chains have. We also think that other ways to address problems which are non-market ways of addressing problems, for instance, in terms of redirecting public spending to community-based and public institutions, or, for instance, policies on redistribution of power are simply, as I said, not an option at all. They are not even considered in this kind of arrangements. Good. The third dimension of problems relates to accountability. None of these initiatives actually have strong mechanisms to hold corporations accountable to the harm to people or to environment that they may be doing. So there is corporate impunity is rampant, and this is, of course, very, very problematic. On the other side, we also think that these multi-stakeholder initiatives are rife with conflicts of interest that undermine accountability and democratic principles of decision-making. Next slide, please. So in our paper, we also look at what have been the initiatives to rein in corporate influence. I'm not going to go into the details here of the different initiatives that we take a look at. We observe that the human rights system has been the most active arena where initiatives have been developed. For instance, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. But in our view, these initiatives to regulate corporations have been as important as they are, unfortunately not sufficient, or in some regards inadequate. In the paper, we take a look at mainly at the due diligence, which has become the main framing for corporate accountability based on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And we show what are the shortcomings of these principles and in which direction we should continue advocating for change and for development when it comes to human rights accountability. Unfortunately, other domains where we think discussions are necessary in terms of, for instance, strengthening antitrust policies or regulating other forms of regulating, for instance, corporations in order to avoid excessive market power, or regarding the public funding of many of these initiatives, or overcoming the underfunding of public institutions so that corporations cannot, let's say, offer generously their funding, are almost non-existent. So therefore, the paper focuses mainly on the human rights initiatives and shows what our shortcomings are, what could be ways forward. Next slide, please. We also take a look at the discussions around the UN Binding Treaty on Transnational Corporations and Human Rights. This is one of the most recent initiatives. This is still an ongoing negotiation, which has been very difficult to have, but this process is still alive, and it has brought lots of improving the thinking on how to, for instance, go beyond just due diligence and try to move towards a more comprehensive accountability framework for corporations when it comes to, of course, the worst excesses and harms and human rights violations. But please, next slide. Our paper, therefore, ends with a couple of recommendations, 3 recommendations. And the first one is about the need to develop a UN-wide corporate accountability framework. So far, we have a very fragmented standards when it comes to, for instance, conflicts of interest. We only have a robust policy on conflicts of interest at the level of the World Health Organization and the frameworks for controlling tobacco consumption. But for instance, on the food policy area, we don't have such a policy yet. Therefore, I think we would like to see this discussion at UN level so that we don't need to go from organization to organization in a fragmented way, trying to implement or adopt such a standard. So this is the first recommendation, that we think that in order to address this undue influence, we should start addressing the issue of corporate accountability. Of course, this would imply mechanisms for avoiding and preventing conflicts of interest, but it would also imply other measures, for instance, to reduce corporate market power, to strengthen competition policies, also issues of strengthening the rules that govern financial markets, so to reduce the capacity of firms and private investors to profit from financialized activities like speculation in food commodities, and of course, the stricter rules on lobbying and spending and campaigning that influence governments and all these activities. I refer to corporate undue influence also in the realm of food and science. Of course, conflict of interest safeguards are also important for academic and scientific institutions. and issues of strengthening public finances are part of this rethinking, and that corporations are actually not essential, because I think this is one of the main issues that they have managed to convince the public and governments that they are absolutely central and fundamental, and therefore they have to sit at the table and negotiate the rules. But we don't think that this is the case, and in many cases they are the problem. So we need to overcome that normalization of power. Next slide, please. Yes, so our big message is to move beyond damage control. As I said, it's very important that the UN Binding Treaty on Transnational Corporations and Human Rights moves forward. In October this year, we will have another round of negotiations on the treaty, but it's still a long way. It's not, let's say, that it's going to be adopted this year, so we still work hard. And as I said, it tackles only the worst excesses. Of course, it will be important in order to overcome corporate impunity, but we also need, the paper conveys very strongly the message that we also need structural reforms. And therefore, we think that the most important ones is pushing for democratization of the governance of food systems in all relevant fora. This means that the institutions that are in place need really a big push in terms of democratizing. If I think, for instance, of FIO, I mentioned before that we don't even have enough public information about the budget of FIO. So this is part of democratizing this institution, and of course, ways of participation of the groups most affected by hunger and food insecurity, which is not institutionalized in FIO. We cannot enter, for instance, the FIO Council. We cannot participate in these discussions there. So this is very important, but also at all levels. But the focus of our paper was global governance, and therefore this is where our main recommendation is. And besides this, we also think that autonomous spaces for people's organizations and social movements and other civil society actors, it's very important to foster these spaces. And here we look in the paper into experiences of food policy councils, for instance, food juries, and there is a lot of experimentation at local level on how to increase direct participation of people in decision-making around food. And we think that these spaces need to be increased. There is really a huge need, and this is probably the other important message to deliver, that for the transformation of food systems, we need new institutions. I think that if we take into account, let's say, the ecological foundations of food, we realize the limitations of the existing institutions and social arrangements that we have to govern these resources and to govern very complex things like food systems. And therefore, we need to also be creative in terms of new ways of strengthening public, community-based ways to exercise the governance of food systems. So I would stop here, because I think it's much more interesting to engage now with the audience and their questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sofía, and thanks for presenting such a clear and a clear overview of the paper that IPES Food will be producing, and highlighting some really critical issues that raise real issues of complexity about how these decision-making institutions function. So thank you. Do put your questions into the Q&A. I will start by one from Anonymous. I don't know who that is, but the question is about funding for the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. Is the solution to get the UN to ask member states to pay more money? How could the UN do this? And would there be risks then to capture by certain governments?
Yes, thank you very much. This is a very interesting question. Well, I think that, so what is the solution? I'm not here to give a solution, and I think we need to look really more in depth into what's going on in FIO and how to, as I said, democratize FIO. I think, yes, the public funding of institutions like FIO should be strengthened. This is our conviction. I know that public funds everywhere in the world are very scarce, that the public institutions everywhere in the world are chronically underfunded. But I think that organizations working around issues of tax justice have done tremendous progress in the latest years. I think if you follow economists like Thomas Piketty or Gabriel Zucman and many other economists, there is really a lot of wealth of policy advice in terms how to increase taxation, which has been regressive for many decades now, and is one of the structural factors of their rising inequalities. Last year in December, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution which will start negotiation on a UN tax convention. Not everything is settled, but this is a very important signal. The UN is now ready to discuss a mechanism, a UN-based mechanism, basically to increase public funding through taxation. And to have, of course, I mean, this is the aspiration, that we will have a mechanism which is able also to have redistributive effects in a world scale, because it's going to be a UN tax convention and it's going to be probably a UN tax agency. So there are new ways, new ideas in terms of how to increase taxation. I read, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the European Union finally adopted a basic taxation percentage of 13%, if I'm not mistaken, for the entire European Union. So I think we are moving in terms of increasing taxation and, of course, public funding. And so therefore, the idea is that, yes, the FIO should be mainly funded by member states. Now, the risks that you are saying that is going to be controlled by central governments, well, I am not sure this is a new risk. This is the reality. This is what we have been seeing in the case of FIO in all its history, because FIO has been dominated by the US from the start. And I think the case that we don't have, for instance, a way to have international food reserves, because the US wanted to have rather a policy of relying on global trade and on food aid by donors like the US, is showing that the US was able to exercise all this power all these years. So therefore, we want a public strengthening of FIO, but we have also to make progress in terms of democratizing the way the organization is run, in order to avoid that a powerful country is able to dictate basically what this international public organization is doing or has to do.
Well, thanks for that comprehensive and interesting answer. Anthony's got a question which is kind of following from that. He says, isn't it a big part of the issues that under UN rules, both businesses and civil society are considered non-governmental organizations or NGOs? So should a UN rule be drawn up to divide them into two separate categories? So first of all, is that correct? Are both business and civil society considered NGOs? And if so, is that somewhere where work could be done?
Well, I think the UN consider businesses and civil society non-state actors. But not NGOs, but non-state actors. Now, non-state actors is a very broad category. It goes for terrorist associations to NGOs or business. So it's really a very wide category of actors. So probably, yes, what we are seeing is, I think, the Sustainable Development Goals and the major groups and the different constituencies. Also, this is also a process which started and was consolidated through in the time of the Rio environmental conferences. So we're seeing a differentiation of constituencies, what it is called constituencies, meaning, of course, business is one, trade unions is another one. We also have women, youth, and the process is in the flow. But I think, yes, we're moving to a process where there is this differentiation for sure. So the category non-state actors is simply too broad. Yeah, and we are in the process of seeing, as I said, again, how to democratize the UN, make it much more responsive, especially to the groups most marginalized. Yeah, and this is the direction that we hope we will be moving.
Thank you. And another associated one from Caroline, who says, can you say a bit more specifically about civil society organizations and about the way that you envision, if you do have a vision for how they would be included in food systems governance? Would it be separate, disparate CSOs engaging, she says, or do you think it should be one group coming together in a more collective action type of approach?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, here, I think the UN Committee on World Food Security, which is, well, one of these UN institutions in charge of the global governance of food, is an interesting example in the sense that it has recognized, I think we are now by 11 constituencies. This committee was reformed in 2008, 2009, actually as part of the response to the food crisis at that time. And the committee, one of the most interesting reforms was precisely the institutionalized participation of civil society through a civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism. Now, this mechanism has autonomously, so it was not the UN, FIO, or CFS saying to civil society how to organize. Civil society itself decided to organize in 11 constituencies of the groups most suffering most from hunger and malnutrition. So we have constituencies there of landless people, of indigenous peoples, pastoralists, fisherfolk, small farmers, peasants, small farmers, women, and people living in urban food insecure people, and so on. So this is, it has been an interesting experience. It shows that I don't think that we need to speak just with one voice. I think the experience in the Committee on World Food Security shows that this diversity of perspectives, of interest, is important to take into account. And through a mechanism like the civil society and indigenous people mechanism, is possible to get a conversation and to agree, you know, to have agreements on what should be the positions represented in the policy process with the CFS. I think probably this is what, in my experience, has been the most rich experience. It's not free of conflict. For instance, recently, we have a very deep tensions around issues of gender diversity, for instance. Is a very, very sensitive topic for governments and for certain areas of the world, including within civil society. But it is important, I think, just the fact of having these conversations, you know, and trying to find agreements despite the tensions is a very constructive process, I have to say. So therefore, in my view, this model should be deepened and improved.
Well, it's good to have a model to look to. A question from Patty. She says that she and Ibfan and are pushing for a transformation of food systems according to a One Health approach. And she says, I wonder if this is pie in the sky, given FAO's working in partnership with CropLife and other opaque industries, reading from her question, or whether you think that this is something that can be really taken forward.
Well, I think that the One Health approach is extremely interesting also because it's making the systemic connection between food, agriculture, health, and environment, right? I think that this is the crucial task for all of us, how to really get grasp of this systemic approach. It's extremely complex. It requires probably a different thinking. We are not used to holistic. We are used to our silos, you know, to our little turfs and so on and so forth. So in that sense, in my view, the challenges of getting new institutional arrangements at that scale to be able to really implement the One Health approach is one of the main challenges. Now, we have, of course, complications, and one of the complications is certainly the corporate capture, as I said, in some of in the UN spaces, not just the FIO. If you take UNEP, this is also a bit problematic, or if you take now the UN Framework Agreement for Combating Climate Change is also very complicated. Now the president of the next COP is the president of an oil company, right? And so, yeah, very complicated. But yes, I think that the One Health approach is for sure a very important one that we also need to improve.
Great, thank you. Now some challenge here from Seth. He says, can you share some concrete examples of corporate influence on the UN Food Systems Summit? And he says, what I saw is that a small number of NGOs had huge influence on that meeting, but I didn't see concrete evidence of corporate influence. So he's asking for some concrete examples, if you can share any.
Yes. Well, let me say first that the UN Food Systems Summit, we saw a very influential role of business associations. So it's not that Coca-Cola company was there or Monsanto. It was business associations. I could show a graphic. We did some infographics in the CSIP, the Mechanism for Indigenous Peoples, where you can see the different actors who were there. But it is clear that the World Economic Forum, for instance, at the beginning of the summit, well, the UN Secretary General signed a partnership agreement with the World Economic Forum. At the World Economic Forum, one of the strategic areas that they have been working on for quite some time is, of course, food security and nutrition. So it is clear that they played a role. At the World Council on Business Council on Sustainable Development had also a very prominent role. And on the multi-stakeholder initiatives like GAIN and the Sun Movement, philanthropies, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation have a prominent role there. Now, of course, there were NGOs. Well, my organization was not there because we joined the camp who said it's biased. It doesn't make sense for us to engage in this summit. So we remained outside in critical dialogue with the summit. I know that there were NGOs there for sure. Probably they were influential. I cannot tell you, but yes, some of them were coordinating I can't remember work streams that the summit had. Probably they were also influential. My point is that I mean, some of these NGOs are, let's say, agree with corporate solutions. So in that sense, they can be influential precisely because they are aligned with corporate interests. Yeah, so I can give you more detailed information. I don't know, separately, perhaps I will put in the chat the link to these infographics where you can really see the different connections and so on.
Great, thank you. So moving to Annette, you've talked about the power of corporations, the power of business associations, the power of different governments, and then how that plays out against the power of civil society organizations and other actors. And you've also mentioned donors quite a bit, and Annette asked, is the hidden power of donors similar to the power levels possessed by the big corporations, and she's referring to the big philanthropic organizations that you referred to.
Yes, I think that donors in terms of private foundations like the Gates Foundation, for instance, it's very powerful, setting the agenda of research, for instance, and now the agenda of the digital transformation. They are in partnership with FIO, funding different initiatives. Yeah, so they are very powerful for sure. And also, I mean, at regional level, not only in Africa, I think the best known example is the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA. But I myself did also a research on the Gates Foundation and Microsoft in the digitalization agenda for Latin America, and their influence has been enormous. For instance, in my country of origin, Colombia, they are funding the internet infrastructure in rural areas in Colombia for about 30% of the population, and this is Microsoft. So no doubt their influence is just huge. And I also think that I also understand donors in terms of the development cooperation, what used to be called development aid, because, for instance, the German development aid, the Dutch development aid, British, Australian, and the European Union, are the main donors of multi-stakeholder initiatives. So, for instance, I think the UN Food System Summit was funded also mainly with European funds, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so in that sense, these donors, this type of donors, are also major actors in this process.
So to follow on that point, thank you, from Amber. She's making the point that she comes across in her work that even civil society organizations might be, whether explicitly or not explicitly, funded by industry. So the question that she has is, do you have some best practices or specific recommendations just when it comes to transparency? I mean, you mentioned about FAO earlier and the data not being there, but do you have some actual recommendations to ensure these transparency issues in global food governance?
Yes, in our paper in IPAS Food, I was giving today a preview of the paper, which is about to be launched in February, but we give very specific recommendations in terms of conflict of interest, for instance, in terms of how to adopt comprehensive accountability frameworks, because we think that in order to really address the issue of corporate accountability, the treaty, the UN binding treaty, won't suffice. It's one instrument, but it will be very important that, for instance, FIO's own policies on preventing conflict of interest, but also providing remedy for wrongdoings that FIO may be doing, is extremely important to do. So therefore, if FIO enters into a partnership with a corporation and in the course of this project or program, someone is affected in her rights, this person has to have the possibility to have access to justice and the possibility to address FIO and seek, an investigation, to start an investigation on why FIO is doing this or that with this corporation. So therefore, we think that this is also extremely important. FIO has in place a due diligence strategy. We think is insufficient because it's merely formal, but it's not giving enough clout, especially to rights holders, to be able to reclaim their rights. So I think these are the parts that we recommend, but we also recommend more structural reforms in terms of public funding, as I said earlier, on the question of budgets of FIO, for instance. We also think that strengthening antitrust policies is absolutely key at this moment, and it should be done to tackle issues of more market power and redistribution policies. I didn't address today the issue of land, for instance, but land property is extremely concentrated. According to the figures of the land matrix, for instance, 1% of farms control almost 70% of agricultural lands worldwide. It's an unbelievable concentration. And many of these lands are controlled through tax havens because these are investments that are controlled by other investments and by other investments. And it happens that many of them sit precisely in tax havens. So this is a serious problem. And I think redistributive policies today implies this kind of measures, like, for instance, closing down tax havens.
So there's clearly a lot of things that can be done at many different levels. There's a couple of questions asking about FIAN International, the organization of which you are Secretary General and clearly have worked at for many years. So the question is, could you tell us more about the work that you do? And Emily adds to that, what interest in particular does FIAN face in its work of corporate influence? And she also says, if you don't mind, would you be able to share how you got into this type of work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, well, I'm a human rights defender. I started my career working actually on land and agrarian reform issues. This was the late 90s, when it was extremely awkward to say that we wanted redistribution in land policy. So many people, it was the height of neoliberalism, you probably recall that. And therefore people, I remember I was a young, a young woman, and I remember that it was almost an impossible struggle. I mean, to tell World Bank, for instance, or to claim that land reform should be done. And people would say, but land is not important. So you want to tie peasants, you want to tie small farmers to the past. And now, today, we see what a strategic resource is land, right? For many things. So therefore, this is how I started. And I think my career was very much influenced by the collaboration with landless people, small-scale farmers, fisher folk, indigenous peoples. So these were also, it was very important for my education and my whole thinking, and also for the development of the right to food, I would say, also in the United Nations. I mean, when these organizations like La Via Campesina, I remember having trainings on human rights with them. And when at some point they started thinking, okay, you say right to food, okay, good. But we think we have a right to land and a right to seeds. And from this, they developed this idea that peasants have rights. And they started, claiming to the UN to recognize the rights of peasants. And I remember at that time, it was like a crazy idea. I remember talking to Amnesty International, for instance, oh, could you support us with this new idea? Ooh, this was going to take you forever, and we are not sure about the right to land, and it's going to be very, very difficult. And it is unbelievable that this declaration on the rights of peasants finally was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2018. It took less time than the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So it was incredible. I want to highlight this little thing just to say that all what I have learned and I have done, it has been in collaboration with these people. And yeah, it has been very important for me. I forgot now what else was the question, but
you've answered the second half of the question, which is fascinating. So thank you for sharing that. It was about the organization FIAN International, about the work that you do, and in particular in relation to the corporate capture issue.
Yes, thank you very much. So again, back to that question. Well, FIAN is an organization which started actually is very related to Amnesty International. Also, our founders came from a local group from Amnesty International who realized in the mid of the 80s that many cases of, detention, arbitrary killings, of violations of civil and political rights were actually related to struggles for social rights, like land, trade unions for better labor conditions, and so on and so forth. So therefore, they founded that organization in the mid-80s in order to develop the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which was at that time underdeveloped compared to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Amnesty International was founded in the 60s and was able to bring forward of all this development on civil and political rights, but we were lagging behind because of issues of the Cold War. And in the mid-80s, this started changing, and therefore right to housing, right to health, right to education, all of these organizations started at that time. So FIAN was also a pioneer in that field. And so we started with this combination of further developing, let's say, the legal international system for the recognition of the right to food and social rights, and combining advocacy with training and activism. So it's a combination. And our idea is to support all struggles related to the right to food. At the beginning, from the start, land has been at the very core, but in the course of the organization, for instance, more recently, we started embracing the issues of nutrition, also as violations of the right to food and nutrition, and looking more into the intersection between health and food, for instance. Yeah, so that has been a little bit the development of the organization. Corporate power started playing a big role. I mean, we have been facing issues of corporate power all along because, for instance, in issues of land, as I said, plantations, mining, infrastructure, all of that is related to corporate influence and power. But we can say that, of course, it became a bigger and a bigger and a bigger problem that we see still from the ground, but of course in policy making in all different levels. But we started putting a special focus on it, I would say, since the start of the negotiations on the binding treaty. And we were at the beginning only working on Geneva at that level, but we started realizing that the discussions there and the conceptual developments in Geneva around this binding treaty have been so rich that it is worth to start that discussion in different places of the UN system. And this is basically what we are doing and what we are joining hands with other organizations. For instance, the recent negotiations on the biodiversity, the framework for the biodiversity, we were involved with organizations embracing issues of corporate capture of biodiversity discussions. Climate is a similar picture, health is a similar picture, and now we are trying to have a much more let's say, stronger collaboration and coordination of these different policy areas.
And so, prompted by a question in the Q&A, but I would also be interested about how this plays out at the country level, both in terms of your work, but also the right to food. So the countries that have embedded right to food into their constitutions or whatever kind of form of documents that they have. And in the chat, it's talking particularly around corporate food system in Colombia, and I don't know whether Colombia has embedded right to food into their policies or
not yet, and the constitution not yet.
Right, but yeah, how does this play out at the country level? I mean, what are the why is it that some countries have this and some I mean, what goes into the battle, as it were, to get it into the constitution or into policy documents, and what difference does it actually make for those countries to have it embedded?
Mm-hmm. I think we have two, let's say, the star examples that we have are, I would say, Brazil and India. Both of them because of the scale of the change that it meant to have a human rights-based approach to food security and food policies. In case of India, if you recall, it was this ruling of the court which said the Indian constitution doesn't recognize the right to food, but there is a ruling in court which says that the right to food is essential for the right to life. So therefore, this was the basis to developing this whole program on the public distribution system for India. Is the largest in the world. And it has, of course, it has done a major difference in terms of preventing people from acute food insecurity. It has many problems. It is and several shortcomings, but it is a very, I mean, it makes a lot of difference. The case of Brazil, at least during the before the coup against President Rousseff, it is a case where a whole system of food security and nutrition strategy and security was developed in the country. First of all, recognizing the agency of the people. So there is a whole system at national, federal level, but also at state level and municipal level of what they call food policy councils. And this is the democratic control. This is the discussion, what decisions should be taken around food and nutrition issues. So I think this is very important to highlight. The second element of the Zero Hunger program of the Lula government, which actually took off Brazil from the hunger map of FAO at that time. So the people suffering from acute food insecurity went below 2 or 3% in the country. It was this combination of strong social security policies, like the cash aid programs, improving labor protection, and so on and so forth, and a combination of strengthening small-scale farm production and agroecological production of food through programs like, for instance, the Universal Public School Meals Program, which is sourced by agroecological production close by from the schools. So it's a mix of different strategic policies and programs, which was extremely successful in terms of reducing substantially the number of people suffering from hunger. Now, with the destruction of democracy that the Bolsonaro government met for Brazil, I remember when Bolsonaro took power, the first measure that he did, 1st of January, I can't remember which day, was to stop CONSEA, the National Food Policy Council of Brazil. So it was a deliberate policy to then force 30 million of Brazilians, 50% of the population today, to hunger. This is what he did. And he dismantled, he reduced dramatically the budget of the food school meal program, for instance, and so on and so forth. So Brazil is really the clear example when you can see in a sort of short period of time what is the difference of having a human rights-based approach to food and how you can destroy it. But well, the case of Brazil is very dramatic because it's about completely destroying democracy and the country.
Yeah, fascinating. Indeed, Brazil is amazing example, fascinating. You mentioned agroecology there. Beatrice has a question. What do you think about agroecology as a way to tackle the globalized corporate food system?
Well, yes, we think that agroecology is an extremely important paradigm to change, to move from a corporate industrial fossil fuel-based food system towards a food system that is going to be sustainable, just, and healthy, because these are the three problems that we have to tackle at the same time: justice, health, and sustainability. So we think that this is the most promising paradigm that we have at the moment, that it is showing really very positive results in terms of reshaping food systems at local level, except for very few examples at a larger scale, like Cuba, some states in India. We don't have larger experiences so far. But we think that with the worsening of the climate crisis, we also saw during the pandemic that when the supply chains were disrupted, there was really a massive going for agroecology, because it was what was there that strengthen the over-reliance on inputs from far away and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, there is no sufficient support for that transition yet. So this is actually the problem that we are facing. But yeah, we need to strengthen these experiences. Is not just a technology. It's important to highlight that it is not just a more sustainable technology for more sustainable farming practices. This is not. It is really a reshaping of power structures. Land is required, so we need to discuss about the land issue, water issues, seed issues, who controls seeds. It is also very much about gender relationships, because it's also about, it has a strong component of revaluing care work and redistributing care work, so that it is not just dumped on women and girls, but men have to do their share also in terms of care. Care of nature and animals is also care work. Cooking, looking after the yield, after children is care work. So all this is part of this vision of overcoming patriarchy, which is very entrenched in the industrial system, but also in traditional agricultural systems.
Thanks for that. You mentioned patriarchy, and I was actually just going to end with one last question I had for you, which has been occurred to me as you were talking, and also with the news, as you mentioned, Dilma Rousseff of Brazil, who as a woman leader had problems kind of above and beyond the political aspects. And in the news today, you might have seen that the Prime Minister of New Zealand has resigned to Jacinda Ardern. And there's a lot of commentary immediately coming out about that, around the role of misogyny and patriarchy, burnout, just the what it is to be a woman leader in very complex political times. And if you don't mind me asking you, are you able to reflect for us at all about how you as a woman have dealt with working in a very, very politicized space? And obviously as a young woman and taking that stance quite young, and then moving on. Would you be able to share some reflections about what sustained you, and the views that you have on any advice for younger women?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I have to say that I think I learned a lot from the younger generation. I have to say, I did my own battles and struggles very much alone. I think perhaps I'm in an age where, I don't know, I was not, let's say, very active I was not active at all in a feminist movement, just to be very honest with you. But of course, I've been a person very sensitive to justice issues, to discrimination issues. And of course, I saw how it was for a Colombian migrant in Germany, to make her way in an organization which was very, I don't know, very German. So that was not so easy. But it was like my own thing. And it was later, when I started seeing the younger women really very articulated in all of that, and so much of that resonated with me. So they gave me words, they gave me ways of seeing and understanding that. So I think that I owe to them a lot. The other thing I would say, it was this, let's say, of community with other women, of course, in the organization, but also in peer organization. FIAN, I think, is an organization which has, I don't know, somehow this is in our DNA. We have been working all along in an ecosystem of organizations. I started my career, as I told you, in the collaboration with Via Campesina. So we have been really developed lots of skills to work in collaborative environments with other organizations. And therefore, I've been very close to peasants leaders, to women in other organizations like TNI, other human rights organizations, focus on the Global South in Asia, for instance. and so on and so forth. So I think that this community, I think this mutual strengthening with these other women was extremely helpful for me, and gave me a lot of confidence and courage to just go the way I had to go.
Thanks for sharing that with us. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I'm personally very committed to, and helped set up something called the Next Generation Initiative, which is looking at women's leadership in nutrition and food systems. And we find that this idea of collective working as a collective and reaching out and engaging with others is very powerful. So thanks very much for sharing that. That's really fascinating. I just have one more question. Actually, there is another question that's been posted, and then I'll close. It's from Tamara, a wonderful woman leader. Thank you for posting it, Tamara, who says about the World Economic Forum, which I know that you mentioned earlier, and she just says, what are your thoughts about it, in particular in the context of the fourth industrial revolution that they talk about, digitization, blockchain, and all of that. Any brief thoughts on World Economic Forum before we close?
Well, I think, as I said, we agree that industrial food systems are unsustainable. They agree with that as well, and they are also trying to go for an agenda of change. I think our disagreement is with the direction of the change. Because they want to fix the problems of sustainability with technology. For instance, when it comes to the use of pesticides, they say, and this is the fourth revolution, precise agriculture. So all these devices to control by satellites and so on and so forth, and automatized ways of applying for pesticides to be very precise and not over apply and so on and so forth, is what is going to bring the change. And well, we fundamentally disagree, because with agroecology we have a way where you dramatically reduce or not even use synthetic agrochemicals and pesticides. So I think that this is the discussion. So therefore, in our view, their proposals are trying to maintain corporate power in food systems in new forms. And of course, the digital revolution is one main tool to get that. So we disagree with that, because in our view, the response to the dramatic challenges that we have ahead is a fundamental change in issues of redistributing power. The very idea of economic growth with the ecological crisis is just a survival crisis. And I think we agree with all the thinkers and with the young people on the streets and on these demonstrations. We need really a fundamental way of rethink the way we are inhabiting this planet. And we think food is at the very core, is a very strategic place to contribute to that change. And this is what we are trying to do.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much, Sofía, for that conversation with our audience. Thank you very much to our audience for posing such fantastic questions to you. And it was a real pleasure for me to host this. I have to say, this is actually going to be my last Food Thinkers. I'm going to be moving on from the Centre for Food Policy shortly. But not to worry, our Food Thinkers speakers will continue, and we're going to continue the focus on highlighting the work of great women. We're going to be featuring Sweta Manohar and World Food Prize winners Cynthia Rosenweg and Shankuntala Thilsted in the next few months, for example. We're also going to be relaunching our symposium, which took a break during COVID, on April the 27th, which is going to deal with the issue of how you can craft co-benefits in food systems, co-benefits for times of crisis, finding positive food policy solutions to multiple food systems challenges. So do join us for those events and sign up for our newsletter. And I look forward to participating from further afield, but the series will no doubt go from strength to strength. So thank you very much again, Sofía, and to our participants for your fabulous talk and conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinna. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And yeah, take care. Hopefully to meet you soon again somewhere else.
Yeah, we will. Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.